Good morning. Welcome to the Michigan State University Extension Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. I'm Sarah Franzak. I'm an environmental management educator based out of Hillsdale County. Thanks for joining us. This morning, we have a presentation by MSU Extension cover crop specialist, Dean Baas, and he's going to be presenting about cover crops following wheat. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get them answered after the presentation. You ready, Dean?
Okay, good morning everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about cover crops and a lot about cover crops following wheat. I wanted to start just to give everybody kind of a state of cover crops in Michigan update. The most recent data that we have is from the National Ag Statistics Service. It's their 2017 census. And Michigan is 8th in the nation. Now, I have to qualify that because that's based on total number of cover crop acres, which we have 673,205 acres of cover crops that were reported, but that really doesn't take into account the number of cover crops as it relates to the amount of ag land. So there's some states like Texas which have over 1 million acres, but that's also a much bigger land mass. So I'll qualify that a little bit. We're up 54% from 2012, the last time the census was taken. So that all of the ag land that we have in Michigan, that is still only about 8.5% of the ag land in Michigan has cover crop use on it. So we still have a ways to go. The figure to the right there of Michigan shows county by county use of cover crops. Now I did do this figure based on the cover crops as a percentage of ag land in those counties. And you can see the darker green areas. We have some counties that are in the 20% range, even getting close to 30%. The top counties on a pure acre basis are Huron, St. Joseph, Tuscola, Sanilac, and Montcalm. I'd like to challenge every county to try to have as many cover crop acres as the Keweenaw County up there at 64.3%. There's not a whole lot of ag land there, so they're doing really well, but I think that'd be a good target for everybody. Let's talk a little bit about cover crop benefits just to kind of get us grounded on what farmers are saying and where we're at. This comes from a Sustainable Ag Research and Education, SARE, Conservation Technology Information Center survey that was done back in 2015, 2016. And you can see that increasing soil health and reducing erosion and increasing soil organic matter are the top three. The increasing soil health, soil organic matter, I think we can contribute that to the NRCS soil health initiative that has been around for a while, that has raised the awareness of soil health and the use of cover crops for soil health. Reducing compaction comes in fourth. Fibrous root systems, I think that's kind of in that same category. But no, nitrogen scavenging and controlling weeds are in the top. Now, all of that soil health, soil organic matter, they really contribute to what I think is getting to be more and more important as far as cover crops, and that's resilience to extreme weather, both precipitation and drought. That's increasingly seen as a long-term benefit of cover crops. We see the land being able to take water better, store water better, and protect that soil surface. So as we move forward, I think that is something that we need to consider as far as cover crops and the benefit to a farming system. Why cover crops after wheat? The period after wheat provides one of the best growing windows to maximize the benefits of cover crops. We've got a really good period growing season left. That also gives us species options that are much greater. And if you have more species available to you, you have a lot more goals that can be achieved with your cover crop. So how do you go about selecting a cover crop after wheat? We really encourage farmers to look at what your goals are for that field. What do you want the cover crop to do for you? And in addition, cover crops just don't do one single thing. They provide multiple services. So you may want to look at a couple things that you would like to do. The chart that I have here on the right lists typical goals for cover crops. Are you looking for something to scavenge cement? You want a soil builder, erosion fighter, weed fighter. Maybe you're looking for some forage and some grazing. Maybe you like some quick growth to get the ground covered. All of these options that we have listed here will work after wheat. So you can see there's a lot of options, and it really depends what you'd like to achieve on that field. And in addition to the goals, you can look at other potential advantages, and don't forget to take a look at what some potential problems might be. You don't want to get into a situation where you decide to use annual ryegrass, you don't get it terminated properly, and then you end up with it becoming a weed and giving you a problem through the season. So be sure and take a look at what some of the potential challenges with each of these cover crops are, so that you can keep that in mind and make sure that you do what you need to do to avoid those problems. The other consideration is termination. Maybe you don't want to mess with terminating with a cover crop in the spring. So you may want to look at whether a cover crop will winter kill, so that you can let Mother Nature do the termination for you, and you won't have problems with that in the spring. There's a range of different functional groups here, and depending on what you're trying to achieve, that will determine what functional group you're in. We like to encourage people to get some diversity in their systems, particularly with the corn, soybean, wheat rotation. If you can get a brassica in there, and particularly after wheat is a good time to look at getting a brassica in there, something like radishes or turnips, rapeseed, mustard, something in the brassica family will give you some additional diversity. So some of you are saying, that looks like a lot to sort through. MSU and the Midwest Cover Crop Council have worked to produce a recipe for cover crops, for a cover crop after wheat. This is for people just starting out with cover crops, and if you are just looking for something that works well, is easy to manage, we recommend using an oats and radish mix after wheat. It grows quickly, puts on a lot of biomass, will suck up nutrients, and both the oats and the radish will winter kill, so termination in the spring is not an issue. This is a good starter cover crop for getting started if you have not done cover crops before. Gives you a grass and a brassica together, and is fairly easy to manage. This recipe is available at the website that's there. And I'd like to add that we also have these types of recipes for after corn and after soybeans. And we'll soon be coming out with 2 additional cover crop recipes for after corn silage, one for corn silage going to soybeans and one for corn silage going back to corn. So those are available on our website, which I'll put that information up here in a little bit. Some of you want to play around a little more with what your options are and would like something to help guide you through that system. We recommend taking a look at the Midwest Cover Crop Council's Cover Crop Decision Tool. It's available at mcc.msu.edu. It allows you to put your county in, additional information about your field, and pick up to 3 goals, and it will show you how the different cover crops are rated for those goals. I wanted to point out here, if you look at this list, and I know it's kind of hard to read, but if you look at this chart, you can see that that all of the cover crops that we have on the list fit in that window after wheat. The shaded blue area shows up till wheat harvest. All of those cover crops, most of them except for the millets there, are available after wheat. So you have a lot of them to get a cover crop in there and get it working for you and help improve your fields. We have a couple of other things to help you for cover crops after wheat. There's a fact sheet, cover crop choices following wheat. There was recently published an MSUE news article, cover crops are on deck as wheat and other small grains are being harvested. We recommend those as some additional literature that you can take a look at and get some more insight into using cover crops after wheat. Wanted to talk about improving your success with cover crops after wheat. I like to say you need to treat your cover crop with the same care as your cash crop, because your goal there really is productivity. What you're trying to produce is biomass and roots. That's your goal. Drilling will improve establishment. If possible, we recommend drilling your cover crops in after wheat, particularly no-till drilling is recommended. If you are broadcasting, we encourage you to lightly incorporate. Don't go too heavy on that, but if you lightly incorporate, you improve your seed soil contact. And it's also good to increase the seeding rate by probably about 10% if you're broadcasting, because you will have some losses due to that planting method. The other thing to consider is your after-harvest fertility of the field. Cover crops need nutrients to thrive. So if you put cover crops on a field that the previous crop has basically used up most of the nitrogen and other nutrients, you're probably not going to get a real good stand of cover crops. So if the fertility is low, we recommend putting on some nitrogen, maybe 23 pounds of nitrogen, and that will help improve the establishment and the growth of the cover crops. Some additional resources: we have the MSU cover crop website, covercrops.msu.edu. There's resources there. We also recommend the Midwest Cover Crop Council website and their decision tools at mccc.msu.edu. And the MSU cover crop team is always available to answer questions. We're there to take your calls, take your emails, give you advice. If you got questions about what you're trying to do, feel free to contact anyone on the cover crop team and we will assist you. Finally, we have a cover crop virtual field day coming up. That's on September 2nd. The registration link is up and active, and maybe Sarah could put that link into the chat box so that people could activate or could just click on that link if they'd like to register. We'd like to invite you to that. And in addition, I'll put a pitch in for the rest of the MSU virtual field days. The link for that information for those is given there as well. We have a number of field days that we will be doing virtually this year, so please join us for those. And with that, here's my contact information, and I hope your cover crops make you as happy as this crimson clover appears to have made this young lady happy. So I will give it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Dean. We have a few questions. Bill asked, is it oat radish mix after early harvest beans or corn something that might work?
Some years it may, some years not. It just depends on what we end up for growing season after that. If we get a mild fall and you harvest early enough, but that's really getting borderline, particularly for the radish. The oats will probably work. So that's one nice thing about doing a mix like that is, under the best case scenario, everything in the mix does well, but depending on conditions, one or the other may do well and at least give you a cover crop. But it's getting late in the year for that, and you can't reliably expect to get good growth on both of those. I think we'd have to ask Jeff when we're going to get our first frost this year. And if he says that's going to happen in December, I think that would work out really good. But
if I can ask a question over the phone,
Sure.
Dean, would it be prudent to try to catch this one possible rain event for Sunday, Monday, or do we wait until it's more likely to have 3 or 4 days of small rains in a row, get the cover crop established?
Part of it depends on how you're looking at planting it. If you're looking at drilling it, you get protection from the soil. So if it doesn't turn out to be quite as big a rain as we had hoped, the seed's still protected, and we'll probably do okay waiting for the next rain. If you're broadcasting, or in some cases people aerial seed, where you've got the seed sitting on the ground, the absolute worst thing that can happen is that you get a really light rain and you get just enough moisture to germinate it, but not enough to sustain it and get a root down. And a lot of times you will lose that cover crop. So I think if you're drilling it, putting the seed in the ground, I would say you should be okay doing that. But if you're broadcasting, I would be really cautious of broadcasting under that scenario.
Thanks, guys.
And just to throw this in too, if for the thumb here this weekend, I would say you're looking probably at about 50-50 odds of seeing precip. So, throw the quarter in the air. And precip amounts, probably a couple tenths, a quarter of an inch would be the expected amount if you do if you're lucky enough to be under one of those showers.
Thanks. Great question. Let's take some of the questions for Dean. Do you have any recommendations for late cover crops in organic systems, like around November 2nd?
When you start getting into that time frame, you're really looking at the winter cereals. Winter cereal rye is probably your best option, although you could look at wheat, triticale, winter barley as some options too. But that late in the year, that's really the only reliable cover crop that we have now in an organic system that you're going to have to terminate. And it's one of the things you have to consider is if you do a winter cereal, it's probably going to take a number of tillage passes in the spring to terminate that. So keep that in mind. If you get a really good stand of cereal rye, if you have that type of fall or in a really good spring, you may want to get out there and terminate it early in an organic system so that you can get it controlled and get it killed. So keep an eye on it. People should be scouting their cover crops just like you scout your cash crops. Get out there in the spring, start assessing what you've got, when you need to terminate it, and go on the cautious side.
Right. So talking about scouting, Chris noticed that in your chart that crimson clover was high for insects, and she knows that there's lots of beneficials in there, but are there some harmful ones that you should be looking out for?
So I had a chance to look that up in Managing Cover Crops Profitably, the Bible for cover crops, where, to be honest, a lot of the ratings that we're working with on some of those types of categories do come out of publications like this. And they state that crimson clover is a secondary host to plant pests of the Eleothus species. Includes corn earworm and cotton bollworm. There is some references. What's that? Yeah, I know.
About those. I thought maybe it was a nematode thing, but I
well, and that's what I was going to. That's what I was going to point out is I know particularly the legumes can be a problem for particularly some of the vegetable nematodes, root knot nematode. Forgetting my nematodes off the top of my head, but the vegetable farmers tend to stay away from legumes just because they do promote some of those types of nematodes. So it's probably a combination.
And corn earworm might be a bigger problem in some of the vegetable crops than it has been for field crops. So
yeah, it's probably something we should revisit because it is nice for beneficial insects. It's one that we get a nice blossom and it's great for beneficials, and we've actually seen advantages for pollination in vegetable fruit systems with crimson clover.
okay, thanks.
Question about, do we have any experience with Balansa clover?
We have been trying Balansa clover in Michigan the last couple of years in our cover crop research trials, and we have not had a lot of success with it at this point. Balansa clover is a southern clover, and I think a lot of the hype that you see on Balansa clover comes from more southern states, southern Indiana, southern Illinois. I think they've had success with it, but so far here we have not had a lot of success with it. It does not establish as well as red clover or crimson clover or put on as much biomass.
Do we have any seeding recommendations for seeding with manure?
Again, that depends on the timing. If you're going to put get the manure out there shortly after wheat harvest, I think you have a lot of options.
Well, I was thinking that if it is going to be dry, putting it on with manure might be helpful. It's one way to put water.
And that is actually quite advantageous. We've seen where, particularly with liquid manure, you don't just get the nutrients, you get the water too. So that's a benefit. But all the cover crops in that list, I think fit. If you start getting later in the year again, though, really want to start looking at winter cereals. You want something that's going to take up the excess nutrients and scavenge it and hold it through the winter. And you really need one of those winter cereals to do that for you. Things like radishes can cause problems. They'll take up the nutrients, but when they decay, they could release them earlier than you want so that you lose those nutrients. So we really like to see grasses in with the brassicas, in with things that winter kills so that you've got something to hold those nutrients.
Thanks, Dean. I think we got to everybody's questions about cover crops. I believe Chris has something that she wants to talk about.
Okay, so I thought I would just share, some of us have been trapping. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you, hopefully you can see the map. This is the Great Lakes mapping system that we have. You can see all of the traps that we have across. They go from Nova Scotia all the way over to Michigan. And across the top, some of you can't see this, but we have different pests that we're trapping for. One of those is Western bean cutworm, and this is the current map for Western bean. And wherever there's a trap, wherever there's a zero, it turns red. Wherever there's a trap that's actually present, it's kind of like a little diamond. So we've got some people trapping in the UP, the upper part of Michigan, and then in the lower part of Michigan. And then as insects come into the trap, it changes color. So there's a little slider on the bottom of the screen that when you kind of work through it, if there's a zero, it turns red. And then as you start to get trap catch, you start to see some blues appearing. So we're getting blue on the June 29th, and then we're getting into July. And then the current levels look like this. There are 1,000 Western bean cutworm traps now being monitored. So if you go in close, there's some heavy trap catches now in Ontario and around the Lansing area. There's also some up in the UP. The traps in the northern part of Michigan are not showing up, and I'm not sure why. But this morning I had 160 in my trap, and it's not showing up here on campus. So the flights are really going up for Western bean cutworm. And I just stopped share, so we're back. Some of the corn is really far ahead. Jeff, I think you said we were a week ahead. And it seems like on some of the crop phenology, sometimes it's almost a week and a half maybe. So a lot of corn, we're sort of at peak flight either this week or maybe next. I'm thinking it's this week. And those females are looking for something good to lay eggs, and a lot of the corn is kind of past what they would prefer. So if you're in a dry bean area, they may be switching over to dry beans right now. If you're in a corn area, I think they get desperate and their ovaries get full and they start to dump eggs even on corn that's not so attractive to them. So corn where the tassel's already starting to dry down, and that makes scouting really frustrating. But if I were looking for eggs, it would be like this week and next are probably our peak. And I would caution about, I've heard a few people talking about wanting to go in and spray either corn, or they're talking about going to spray dry beans because they saw some spider mites along the edge, and they also want to throw a fungicide in. One of the worst things you can do if you didn't get rain was to put an insecticide on that doesn't do a good job on mites, or you don't get good coverage, so you don't get good kill of mites. On top of it, you put a fungicide that protects the mites from their normal pathogen when you do get some humidity under that canopy. And you could really flare mites bad. So I would watch the mite kind of situation, but I'd really caution people about, I would think hard about why you're spraying, when you're spraying, and how you're going to spray to achieve good coverage and what products. And then be watching for Western bean cutworm, because if you spray a pyrethroid for Western bean cutworm, just remember that most of those pyrethroids don't have mite control and could actually flare mites afterwards. So I don't know if Marty is on and wants to talk about any what the dawn risk kind of looks like for this year. But if we do get some fields with a lot of Western bean cutworm, they don't cause that situation, but they can exacerbate it.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, I mean, so I think in general we're pretty low risk for vomitoxin this year. Obviously that's driven by moisture, right? And we've been relatively so I think the risk overall is low. We're always going to have pockets that are higher risk, right, given the state. But in general, I think we're pretty low.
So then throwing the fungicide in the tank, your blanket recommendation for Michigan is?
Yeah, I think on the, for the soybeans, yeah, I'd probably be pretty cautious with that, like you say, especially if we're trying to control spider mite on the soybeans. On the corn side of things, we're getting a lot of questions about tar spot management. And, at this point in time, it's pretty low incidence still. But I guess if we're going to go across and maybe make an application to manage Western bean cutworm, I'd probably be tempted at that point in time to potentially look at putting a fungicide on to try and minimize any tar spot that might develop a little bit later, manage what we have there. I mean, ideally, I think with tar spot, we probably still want to wait another week or so, just given how light the amount of infections have been.
And that might actually line up perfect with insects in some area with Western bean, if they're there.
Perfect. Yeah, right. Perfect then. Yeah. So I think, going at green silk it's sort of been our standard timing, right, for fungicides on corn. I think that's just a little bit too early this year, especially for a tar spot, given how dry it's been and how slow things. Disease-wise in corn, it's been very, very quiet in terms of leaf diseases this season. And things are only just starting to pick up.
Chris,
I've been scouting on campus. I've been walking corn that I would lay eggs in, and I haven't seen any eggs. Now there are a few people. Charles Scoville has found some fields up in Isabella County, and there's some. I don't know if Paul Gross in your area, if you've seen any eggs, but I haven't seen anything, and I haven't heard about any fields that were over threshold, but they are flying. So,
Chris, there's a question in the chat for you. What's the threshold for spraying for Western bean cutworm?
So in corn, the threshold in the Western U.S. is 8% infestation, and so we've dropped that down in the Great Lakes region because of the concern of dawn issues, and we use 5%, and the threshold is cumulative. So if you went out and you found 3 out of every 100 plants have an egg mass, you're not at threshold. But if you walk it in 7 days, those eggs have hatched. There's 2% more new eggs. That's threshold. So we've gone to a cumulative 5%. And in dry beans, you can't find the egg masses. So we say look for a trap catch of like 120, 150 in in your area, then start walking those dry beans and wait till you see damage, a little feeding damage on the beans themselves. And that's when you would pull a trigger. So typically the best time to spray dry beans has typically been like first week of August, and you kill what's there and you kill what's coming. It's easier to manage them in dry beans than it is in corn, because you're not looking for them by having to walk through terrible corn.
We have another question for Dean. How many days before the traditional first frost date should Berseem clover be planted?
Okay, so typically we like to recommend getting cover crops in about 6 weeks before for things other than like the winter cereals, so that they get established well enough and that you get enough growth to give you some benefit. Now, I would have to agree with Bill on the Berseem clover. He put in the chat box at 50, 60 days prior to freeze. It's a slow starter. And so you really have to consider when you're deciding on that, just how quickly does the cover crop you're looking at establish. And some of the clovers, Berseem clover, white clover, they're pretty slow at getting established, and you really need to get enough growth if you're going to get any advantage out of that cover crop before the fall, and if you want them to survive in the winter. So I agree with earlier the better, and probably 50, 60 days on Berseem. Makes sense to me.
Would you like to comment about the use of mixed versus single species?
I'm actually kind of good with both. It really depends on your goals. The thing to keep in mind, the advantage of planting a single species is you're managing a single crop in that field. So you can do things that help promote growth of that single species. Anytime you do a mix, you're probably going to be compromising one species over another. We feel, and a lot of work at MSU that Lisa Tiemann has been doing shows that when it comes to mixes, it's really not important that you have a whole bunch of different species. You want a species from each functional group. That'll give you good diversity for your plant biology. And so 3-4-way mixes are good. Some of the 12, 15-way mixes, they're pretty expensive. Now, that being said, there's insurance along with having all those species. Something will probably thrive under whatever conditions you see that year when you have a large mix, but it's not all going to thrive. So it's an insurance policy, and as we all know from our car insurance, that insurance is expensive. So you're going to pay for that insurance. So I think you have to balance how much you're willing to put into cover crops seed from a cost standpoint, and then weigh the benefits and the insurance that you would get from something like that.
Thanks.
I like 2-3-way mixes. I like the crimson, oats, radish, those types of mixes I think are sufficient in most cases.
Would you plant red clover right now?
I don't know. I'd have to ask Paul Gross about that. Typically this time of year, we tend to recommend planting crimson clover instead of red clover. It's thought to do better in this planting window. Some farmers have started looking at red clover in that window and have had some pretty good success with it. So I think red clover is an option, but I think we need to learn a little bit more. And I don't know, Paul, do you want to add anything to that? He gave it a thumbs up.
All right. Any further questions from anyone?
I would just comment how wonderful it is to see Marty's kids.
They're pretty cute.
They're pretty quiet at the moment.
Well, I guess I'll wrap this up. So thanks everybody for joining us, and remember to join us next week. Thanks, Dean, for your presentation, and Jeff and Chris.